Welcome to CEO's Library, the 1% bookshelf. Today we're diving into a fascinating exploration of cultural contrasts and the power of introversion. Imagine two classrooms, worlds apart. In one, students eagerly raise their hands, voices overlapping as they vie for the teacher's attention. In the other, a respectful silence reigns, punctuated only by the scratch of pens on paper, as students diligently take notes. These scenes aren't just different teaching styles. They represent a profound cultural divide in how we value personality traits and self-expression. I'm your host, and in this episode, we'll be exploring Susan Cain's groundbreaking book, Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. Specifically, we'll focus on a chapter that takes us to the heart of Silicon Valley, where East meets West in a unique cultural experiment. We'll examine how Asian cultural values around introversion and quietness contrast sharply with the Western extrovert ideal, and what this means for Asian American students caught between two worlds. But first, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a high school where the football team's performance is met with shrugs, where the library is the social hub, and where students unironically refer to studying as going nerding. This isn't a Hollywood version of high school turned on its head. It's Cupertino, California, home to Apple's headquarters and a fascinating case study in cultural values. In Cupertino, over 60% of residents are of Asian descent, many first or second generation immigrants drawn by the tech industry and excellent schools. It's here that Susan Cain encountered a microcosm of Asian American culture that challenges many Western assumptions about success and sociability. Take Mike Wei, a Chinese American high school senior Cain interviewed. Mike told her, "At school, I'm a lot more interested in listening to what the teacher says and being the good student, rather than the class clown or interacting with other kids in the class. If being outgoing, shouting, or acting out in class is going to affect the education I receive, it's better if I go for education." This attitude might seem foreign to many Western ears, where class participation and social engagement are often seen as key to a well-rounded education. But for Mike and many of his peers, it's a natural extension of values learned at home. Mike explained that if faced with a choice between going out with friends or staying home to study, he thinks of his parents. "That gives me the strength to keep studying," he said. "My father tells me that his job is computer programming, and my job is to study." This focus on academic achievement over social life isn't just a family quirk. It's deeply rooted in many Asian cultures. In Cupertino, it's reflected in everything from summer study habits to social dynamics at school. Tiffany Liao, a high-achieving senior bound for Swarthmore College, put it this way: "I think it's our culture. Study, do well, don't create waves. It's inbred in us to be more quiet. When I was a kid and would go to my parents' friend's house and didn't want to talk, I would bring a book. It was like this shield. And they would be like, 'She's so studious.' And that was praise." Can you imagine that scene playing out in most American households? A child who reads at a social gathering might more typically be encouraged to put the book down and join the group. But in many Asian cultures, this kind of focused, quiet behavior is not just accepted, it's admired. This cultural difference extends to the classroom as well. Hung Wei Chan, a Cupertino mom who immigrated from Taiwan, shared her culture shock upon entering an American university classroom. "I was the quiet person there," she said. "At UCLA, the professor would start class saying, 'Let's discuss.' I would look at my peers while they were talking nonsense, and the professors were so patient, just listening to everyone." Hung's reaction highlights a fundamental difference in educational approaches. In many East Asian classrooms, the traditional curriculum emphasizes listening, writing, reading, and memorization. Talking is simply not a focus and is even discouraged. This contrasts sharply with the Western emphasis on class participation and verbal expression. But why do these differences exist? To understand, we need to zoom out and look at broader cultural patterns. Robert McCrae, a research psychologist, created a fascinating map of the world based not on geography, but on personality traits. His findings? Asia is predominantly introverted, while Europe and the United States are markedly extroverted. This isn't just about individual personality differences. It reflects deep-seated cultural values. In many Asian cultures, the group is prioritized over the individual. Harmony within the family, corporation, or community is paramount. Individuals often subordinate their own desires to the group's interests, accepting their place in its hierarchy. Western culture, by contrast, is organized around the individual. We are encouraged to express ourselves, follow our bliss, and be free of undue restraint. Even when we gather in groups, we do so as distinct individuals, each with our own goals and desires. These contrasting worldviews manifest in the traits each culture values. Westerners tend to prize boldness and verbal skill, traits that promote individuality. Asians, on the other hand, often value quiet, humility, and sensitivity, qualities that foster group cohesion. This preference shows up in surprising ways. In one study, researchers showed Americans and Japanese pictures of men in dominant and submissive poses. The dominant pictures activated pleasure centers in the American brains, while the submissive pictures did the same for the Japanese. From a Western perspective, it can be hard to see the appeal of submission. But what looks like subordination to a Westerner can seem like basic politeness to many Asians. These differing attitudes toward self-expression are reflected in the proverbs of each culture. Consider these Eastern sayings. The wind howls, but the mountain remains still. Japanese proverb. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. Chinese proverb. Now compare them to Western proverbs. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. American proverb. Speech is civilization itself. The word, even the most contradictory word, preserves contact. It is silence which isolates. Thomas Mann. These sayings encapsulate fundamentally different attitudes towards speech and silence. In many Asian cultures, words are seen as potentially dangerous weapons that can hurt others or get the speaker into trouble. Quiet and introspection are signs of deep thought and higher truth. In Western culture, speech is often seen as the primary way to assert oneself and make connections with others. This difference in values can lead to misunderstandings and culture clashes. Don Chen, a Chinese-American Harvard Business School student, shared a story about living with both Asian and Caucasian roommates. When dishes piled up in the sink, his Caucasian friend directly asked the others to do their share of cleaning. He thought he was being polite, but his Asian roommates perceived him as harsh and angry. As Don explained, an Asian in that situation would be more careful with his tone of voice. He might phrase his displeasure as a question, or might not bring it up at all, considering group harmony more important than a few dirty dishes. This focus on relationship honoring leads to social dynamics that can seem remarkable from a Western perspective. For instance, social anxiety disorder in Japan, known as taijin kyofusho, takes the form not of excessive worry about embarrassing oneself, as it does in the United States, but of embarrassing others. It's also why Tibetan Buddhist monks find inner peace through quietly meditating on compassion, and why Hiroshima victims apologize to each other for surviving. As one survivor said, bowing with the skin of his arms peeling off, "I am sorry. I regret I am still alive while your baby is not." These examples highlight the beauty and depth of the Asian approach to social interaction. But it's important to note that Western respect for individual freedom and self-expression has its own merits. The point isn't that one approach is superior, but that this profound difference in cultural values has a powerful impact on the personality styles favored by each culture. Understanding these differences challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about what's natural or normal when it comes to personality and behavior. The extrovert ideal that's so prevalent in Western culture isn't a universal truth. It's a cultural construct, just as valid or invalid as the introvert favoring norms of many Asian cultures. But what happens when these two worldviews collide? That's the fascinating question at the heart of the Asian American experience, particularly for young people navigating between these different value systems. Let's return to Mike Wu, the Cupertino High School senior we met earlier. When Cain first interviewed him, he was still nestled in the Cupertino cocoon, comfortable with prioritizing study over socializing. But when she caught up with him the following autumn, during his freshman year at Stanford, things had changed. Although Stanford is only a 20-minute drive from Cupertino, demographically, it's a world away. Mike seemed unsettled by the change. Sitting at an outdoor cafe, he nodded toward a group of white athletes laughing nearby. Caucasians, he observed, seemed less afraid of other people thinking that what they said was too loud or too stupid. Mike was struggling with the shift in social norms. He found himself frustrated by the superficiality of dining hall conversation and the bullshitting that often passed for class participation. He gravitated toward other Asian students, feeling that they shared his level of outgoingness. "My dorm has 4 Asians in it, out of 50 kids," he told Cain. "So I feel more comfortable around them. There's this one guy called Brian, and he's pretty quiet. I can tell he has that Asian quality where you're kind of shy, and I feel comfortable around him for that reason. I feel like I can be myself around him. I don't have to do something just to look cool, whereas around a big group of people that aren't Asian or are just really loud, I feel like I have to play a role." Mike's experience highlights the double consciousness many Asian Americans develop, part Asian and part American, with each side calling the other into question. On one hand, Mike was critical of the loud, uninhibited behavior of many of his classmates. On the other hand, he sometimes wished he could be that way himself. "They're more comfortable with their own character," he said of his Caucasian classmates. "Asians are not uncomfortable with who they are, but are uncomfortable with expressing who they are. In a group, there's always that pressure to be outgoing. When they don't live up to it, you can see it in their faces." This pressure was coming not just from peers, but from authority figures as well. Mike's freshman advisor, a professor at Stanford's medical school, invited a group of students to her house. Mike hoped to make a good impression, but found himself unable to think of anything to say while his classmates joked around and asked intelligent questions. When he left, the professor teased him. "Mike, you were so loud today. You just blew me away." Mike left feeling bad about himself, concluding, "People who don't talk are seen as weak or lacking." This internal conflict isn't unique to Mike. Many Asian American young people face similar challenges as they try to reconcile the values of their parents' culture with those of mainstream American society. One study comparing European American and second-generation Chinese American teens over a 5-year period found that the Chinese Americans were significantly more introverted than their American peers throughout adolescence, and paid the price with their self-esteem. Interestingly, introverted Chinese American 12-year-olds felt perfectly fine about themselves, presumably because they still measured themselves according to their parents' traditional value systems. But by the time they reached 17 and had been more exposed to America's extrovert ideal, their self-regard had taken a nosedive. This shift in self-perception often starts even earlier for Asian American kids growing up in more typical American communities. Many deliberately try to be more outgoing than their parents, seeing the traditional Asian quiet style as a liability in American society. Even in Cupertino, with its large Asian population, this shift is beginning to occur. Asian parents are starting to see that it doesn't pay to be quiet, Mike told Cain, so they encourage their kids to take speech and debate. Our speech and debate program was the second largest in California to give kids exposure to speaking loudly and convincingly. This adaptation to Western norms isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are undoubtedly benefits to being able to speak up and assert oneself in Western society, but it's worth considering what might be lost in this cultural shift. The Asian emphasis on quiet reflection, careful observation, and group harmony brings valuable perspectives to our increasingly globalized world. In business, for example, the Western tendency to speak first and think later can lead to hasty decisions and missed opportunities. The Asian approach of careful consideration before action can be a powerful counterbalance. Moreover, the focus on relationship honoring in many Asian cultures fosters a sense of social responsibility that's often lacking in more individualistic societies. The idea that one's actions should be considered not just in terms of personal gain, but in how they affect the broader community is a valuable one in our interconnected world. At the same time, the Western emphasis on individual expression and assertiveness has its own strengths. It encourages innovation, challenges to the status quo, and the voicing of diverse perspectives. These are all crucial elements in a dynamic, evolving society. The challenge, then, is not to choose one cultural approach over the other, but to find ways to integrate the strengths of both. This is the opportunity and the challenge faced by Asian Americans and, increasingly, by all of us in our multicultural world. In our workplaces, this might mean creating environments that value both assertive speech and quiet reflection. It could involve structuring meetings to include both open discussion and periods of individual contemplation. It might mean recognizing that the loudest voice in the room isn't necessarily the one with the best ideas, and creating channels for quieter employees to contribute their insights. In our schools, it could mean rethinking our emphasis on class participation as the primary measure of engagement. Perhaps we could find ways to assess students' understanding and critical thinking skills that don't rely solely on verbal expression. We might also consider incorporating more opportunities for individual work and reflection alongside group projects and discussions. On a personal level, it invites all of us to reflect on our own communication styles and biases. Do we automatically assume that the most talkative person in a group is the most competent or likable? Do we give equal weight to the ideas of those who express themselves more quietly or in writing? Are we creating space in our social and professional lives for different personality types to thrive? By embracing the strengths of diverse cultural approaches to personality and self-expression, we enrich our collective experience. We create more nuanced, balanced ways of interacting and problem-solving. We open ourselves to new perspectives and ways of being in the world. As we wrap up our exploration of Susan Cain's insights into Asian cultural values and introversion, I invite you to reflect on your own experiences and observations. How have you seen these cultural differences play out in your life or work? What can you learn from the Asian emphasis on quiet reflection and group harmony? How might you create more space for diverse personality styles in your own sphere of influence? Remember, the goal isn't to become more introverted or more extroverted, but to recognize and value the strengths of both approaches. In doing so, we create a richer, more inclusive world that benefits from the full spectrum of human personality and cultural wisdom. If you found this discussion intriguing and want to dive deeper into Susan Cain's exploration of introversion in various cultural contexts, I encourage you to check out her book, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. You'll find a link to purchase the book or audiobook in this episode's description. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the quiet power of Asian cultural values. Until next time, this is CEO's Library, the 1% bookshelf, reminding you that sometimes the most profound insights come from the quietest voices.